Okay, we have one more little thing that we need to figure out before we can move on to some of the advanced analysis functions for this budget. And that's the question of whether we're going to repay the loan that we took out, right? Because right now we've got our budget that says, okay, well, we were short on cash that first month in June. Even though we sold $387,000 worth of stuff, we actually only collected $362, and we wound up, paying more than that out because we needed to stock up on inventory for coming months, right? Because July is our biggest, well, June is our biggest month, but we continue to have big month in July, right? And so in June, we only wound up with $1,200 in cash in the bank. And so we needed to borrow some money to get up to this $15,000 we needed. And then in July, we had this big capital outlay. And so we wound up actually having to borrow $91,000. No, I'm sorry, $76,000 in order to get us to, I'm misspeaking, I'm sorry. We wound up needing to borrow $91,400 in order to get us to the $15,000 that we need. So the thing is, right, and then the following month, we had a big positive cash flow, and we wind up with $121,000 in cash in the bank. But, nowhere in here do we think about, okay, maybe I ought to pay back that short-term loan, right? And of course, it's expensive to carry short-term debt. So we need to adjust this borrowing line here in our budget to also pay back a loan if we can, right? So what we need to do in order to get to that point is, first thing we need to do is figure out what the total balance is on the loan. Now, it's easy enough to see in this short, in this 4-month budget, but you can see how it might become complicated. So the first thing we need to do is figure out the total balance on the loan, and he's got this line. It's called cumulative borrowing, but I like to call it outstanding loan balance, right? Because this is the total amount that we still owe. Okay, so we do that by adding last month's loan balance, which in May we had no outstanding loans, right? So that was our outstanding loan balance in May, and we add that to the new loan balance that we've acquired in June. So in this cell here, you'd go last month's outstanding loan balance plus the new borrowing, current borrowing, right? So now we have an outstanding loan balance of, or cumulative borrowing of, $13,800. And then in the following month, it goes up to $105,200. And then it stays there because we have no new borrowing in subsequent months. Okay, so that's the first thing. I've got all these notes written out in white font, so I'm just uncovering them as I continue to talk. All right, so now we know how much our outstanding loan is for. And what we need is a logical statement that says if I can afford to, I should pay off that outstanding loan balance, but only to the point that I leave $15,000 in the bank, right? So next month in August, I've got $121,000 at the end of the month in cash in the bank. And I have an outstanding loan balance of $105,000. So the question is, how much can I afford to pay off, right? I can only pay off the amount that'll leave me with $15,000. Now, the question is, right, or actually the statement is, right, if I can afford to, that's already part of the current borrowing equation. Our current borrowing equation says If I have less than $15,000 in the bank, then borrow to make up the difference. It's the otherwise piece, the value if false piece. Right now we've got it at 0. We're not going to borrow anything if we don't need to. But we want to set this up so that we can pay it back, right? So if I can afford to, that is, if the value of my current cash balance, unadjusted cash balance, is greater than $15,000, and there's an outstanding balance in my loan, then I should pay it off. Okay, if I can afford to part is already in the current borrowing equation. So let's figure out, right, how to write language that says pay off the outstanding balance, but only to the point where I leave $15,000 in the bank. Now, Excel has a function for this. It's called the minimum function. It calculates two values and returns the one that's lowest. Okay, so this is another Excel function that you're learning in this chapter. So the value that we want to calculate, right, we want it to return the outstanding loan, or we want it to calculate the outstanding loan balance, and we want it to calculate the difference between the unadjusted cash and the required cash balance. So it looks at the outstanding loan balance up in this row here, and it also looks at the difference between the unadjusted cash balance and the minimum that we need, minimum acceptable cash that we need, and it returns the lowest. Okay, so let's look at an example of just some normal numbers so that you can see how it works logically. Okay. So for instance, this is just a life example. It's got nothing to do with this budget that we're working on, but it's something that you might be able to get your heads around. Okay. We have a total outstanding balance. We owe a total of $20,000, and this month we end the month with $18,000 in the bank. How much can we afford to pay? Well, that's easy enough, right? We can afford to pay $3,000, which is a difference between 18 and 15. Okay, so now, the way that we would write that in Excel's language, this little example here, using actual numbers, right? The function would go minimum, and then your first argument is 20,000, and your second argument is 18 minus 15. Okay, so here we go. The minimum statement becomes the last argument in your if function, and it's going to be, I'm going to put it up there in the current borrowing. Okay, so this is what you do. You take the 0 out. We are going to express repayments as a negative number here. So you write a minus sign, and then you write min, right? It will prompt you. Okay, so the first thing we're looking at is the minimum between the outstanding loan balance. Right, so in this case, we're in column E. Our outstanding loan balance for last month was 0 down here. And then we want the difference between the unadjusted cash balance and the minimum acceptable cash expressed as a absolute cell reference. And I am always nervous about whether I've got these in the right order. Let's just give it a try. We're going to close that parenthesis and see whether it works. It should return that 13.8 still, right? Yeah, okay, so it still returns 13.8. Right? This minimum function only enters the play if the beginning balance, the unadjusted balance, is not less than the minimum acceptable cash, right? So this minimum statement is the value that is returned if this first question, is my unadjusted cash balance less than $15,000, right? This minimum function only enters play if the answer to that question is no. Right? So when you do these kinds of things, it's always a little nerve-wracking, right? And what you want to do is pull it across one column at a time and verify whether it's giving you the numbers that you expect before you go in. And this is only 4 columns wide, but imagine if this was a major budget for years on end, right? So you pull it across the first column and the answer should still be 91.4. So let's see how it goes. Yep, okay, it's still 91.4. So far so good. Now the next column, right, we can see that we have $121,000 left over at the end of the month, which is obviously greater than 15. And so this should now return us the negative of whatever our outstanding loan balance is, unless the difference is less than 15. So let's just pull this across and see. Yep, so it pays off the loan. Now, look at. Now we have 0 automatically calculating as our outstanding loan balance. Right, so this should continue to be 0 here. Yep. All right, so it seems to be working. Now, one last thing, I always test these things, and the way that I'm going to test it, first I'm going to save, right? And the way that I'm going to test whether this function works is I am going to, let's see, so we're only left with $1,300 more than this minimum in the bank, right? So I'm going to test this function by making my unadjusted cash balance somewhere below 120,000. That way, if I pay off the whole thing, I'll go below the minimum cash balance. So let's just plug in the number 100,000 here and see what happens. Yep. All right. So I only pay off 85, which is the difference between 100 and 15, which means that I have 20,200 left at the end of the month, which I pay off the following month. So it seems to be working. So I can go ahead and hit undo, put that number, put that calculation back where it belongs, and this thing seems to be working. So we have a functioning budget. Hooray. Now for the fun part. I'm going to hit save, and I'm going to hit stop on my recording, and we will start talking about scenarios and really putting this budget on steroids next.